Hey guys, tonight we begin with the last golden summer of mankind, Europe, in 1914, where sunlight bathed old palaces, trains rushed past busy stations, and men in tailored suits quietly opened the lid of a coffin meant for an entire world order. There were no alarms, no sirens, just a bright morning in Sarajevo where a gunshot didn't just end a life, it marked the beginning of a century's nightmare. They didn't know it then, but every memo, every telegram, every handshake in wood-panelled rooms was already a silent bullet. And the true weapon, pointing at Europe's heart, was the calm, steady hand of its most powerful men. I'm here to tell the story. You only need to lie down and listen. Before we begin, Jays, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always a strange and beautiful thing to realize people from across the world are sharing this very same moment. Oh, and if you find stories like this help you sleep better, or maybe just help you think more deeply, feel free to leave a like or subscribe to the channel, but only if it truly feels right to you. No pressure here. That's not what this space is for. Now then, turn off the lights. Huge. Let a soft breeze in. Put on your headphones. In a few seconds, your screen will slowly dim. Not a glitch, but a choice. Blue light at night disrupts your melatonin, the hormone that helps you relax and sleep. A little darkness will let your brain know it's time to rest. And now, let's begin. It did not begin with the single sharp crack of a pistol. Not really. That sound echoing through the sun-drenched streets of a provincial city was merely the last tumbler falling into place, the final audible click of a lock that had been meticulously set for years. The true crime was the lock itself, an intricate mechanism of ambition and suspicion forged in the silent wood-panelled halls of power across a continent that believed itself to be at the zenith of civilization. Europe in the golden summer of 1914 was a masterpiece of lethal design, a beautiful, fragile thing, wholly unaware that the men who governed its fate were methodically preparing its grave. They spoke of honor, of alliances, of necessity. They wrote their memorandums and dispatched their telegrams with the steady hands of dutiful professionals. In doing so, they assembled the perfect weapon, pointed it directly at their own heart, and waited only for an excuse to pull the trigger. The continent was divided, cleaved into two immense and wary families, bound by promises written in ink and sealed with fear. On one side there was the understanding, the Entente, a nervous pact between the world's greatest naval power, Great Britain, an island empire whose security depended on the unchallenged dominion of the waves, France, a republic still nursing the phantom pain of past defeats and dreaming of reclaiming its lost pride, and the colossal enigmatic expanse of Russia, a giant stirring from a long slumber, its immense potential a source of both hope for its friends and profound anxiety for its rivals. They were united not by shared affection, but by a common growing apprehension of the power rising in the heart of Europe. This power was Germany, the core of the second great family, the Triple Alliance. A new and vigorous empire, Germany felt the press of its neighbors as a tightening vice, a deliberate encirclement designed to stifle its destiny. Its every industrial triumph, its every new battleship launched, seemed only to deepen the scowl of its neighbors. Germany's primary partner was the sprawling, antiquated Austro-Hungarian Empire, a fragile mosaic of feuding nationalities clinging to its imperial grandeur with the trembling hands of old age, desperate to project an image of strength it no longer truly possessed. And then there was Italy, a nation bound to the alliance by calculation rather than conviction, its eyes forever scanning the horizon for opportunity, particularly at the expense of the French. These two great houses of power watched each other their polite diplomatic exchanges, barely concealing the tension of a duel about to begin. Every military budget, every secret pact, every saber rattled in a distant colony was a move in a silent, deadly game. And on the 28th of June in the city of Sarajevo, that game was about to become terrifyingly loud. The day was warm, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and summer dust. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the fragile Austro-Hungarian throne, was on a tour of inspection, a public display of imperial authority in a restive corner of his future domain. He rode in an open-topped car, a symbol of modernity and accessibility, his plumed helmet catching the bright morning sun. The crowds were a mix of the curious, the loyal, and the resentful. Hidden among them, moving with the nervous energy of youth and conviction, was Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old consumed by the fervent dream of a unified Slavic nation. He and his fellow conspirators saw the Archduke not as a man, but as a symbol of the oppression they sought to destroy. The procession moved slowly, a perfect, predictable target. A first attempt on the Archduke's life that morning had failed, a poorly thrown explosive device, injuring bystanders and adding a current of chaos to the day's rigid schedule. But fate, or perhaps just a driver's wrong turn, offered a second unthinkable chance. As the Archduke's car stalled trying to reverse on a narrow street, Princip found himself standing just feet away from his target. He raised his pistol. The movements were mechanical, almost dreamlike. The lift of the arm, the alignment of the sights, the squeeze of the trigger. 2 shots, 2 sharp reports that cut through the murmur of the crowd. The Archduke slumped forward. His wife Sophie collapsed beside him. For a moment, there was only confusion, a surreal tableau of frozen shock under the Balkan sun. Then the screaming began. The news spread by telegraph, the staccato clicks spelling out the unbelievable event across the continent. In Vienna, the shock curdled into a cold, calculated fury. The assassination was not merely a tragedy. It was an intolerable insult, an act of aggression from their troublesome little neighbor, Serbia. This was the moment, the justification they had been waiting for to crush the Slavic nationalism that gnawed at the foundations of their empire. The investigation, such as it was, became a formality. The government of Austria-Hungary accused Serbia of having armed and aided the young assassin, a charge that rang with the conviction of predetermined guilt. Diplomats began to draft a response, not a letter of condolence, but a weapon forged from paper and ink. They worked methodically, choosing each word with the precision of a surgeon, crafting 10 demands so severe, so humiliating that no sovereign nation could ever accept them. It was an ultimatum designed to be rejected. A carefully constructed casus, belly disguised as a diplomatic inquiry. The document was finalized, the paper heavy with the weight of unspoken intentions, and dispatched to Belgrade. Its delivery marked the beginning of the end of the old world. A clock had been set, and it was now ticking down, not to a negotiation but to a declaration of war. In Belgrade, the Austrian note arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet finality of a death sentence. It was a crisp sheaf of papers, the text meticulously typed, the language, a masterpiece of diplomatic cruelty. For 48 hours, the Serbian government existed in a state of suspended animation, the document lying on a polished table in a smoke-filled room, radiating a cold malevolence. To read its 10 points was to understand that Austria-Hungary sought not justice but subjugation. They were demands designed to be refused. A demand that Austrian officials be allowed to operate on Serbian soil to root out subversive elements was a blade aimed directly at the heart of Serbian sovereignty. The Serbian reply was an act of profound and desperate diplomacy. They conceded almost everything, swallowing their national pride in great painful gulps. They agreed to suppress publications, to dissolve nationalist societies, to remove officers from their army. They yielded on 9 of the 10 points, a capitulation so near total it bordered on surrender. But on that final, impossible point, they demurred. They could not allow foreign agents to conduct a judicial inquiry within their own borders. It was the one line they could not cross. They offered to refer the matter to the International Court at The Hague, a final futile appeal to the civilized reason that had already fled the continent. The response from Vienna was swift and contemptuous. The Serbian reply was dismissed before the ink was truly dry. There were no further negotiations, no last-minute appeals for calm. The Austrian ambassador in Belgrade simply telegraphed his government that the conditions had not been met, and then, with the detached efficiency of a man closing an office, he packed his trunks and departed. Within hours, a new message was being transmitted, this one, from Vienna to Belgrade. It was a formal declaration of war, a simple administrative act that set the world on fire. That night, the Danube River, which separated the two empires, became a frontier of fire. The first artillery shells fired from Austrian gunboats arced through the summer darkness. They landed in Belgrade, not as a precise military strike, but as an act of terror. The explosions were a deep concussive baseline against the sudden shrill treble of panicked shouts and shattering glass. The city, which had been holding its breath for days now, gasped in a collective seizure of fear. The war had begun. The news of the shelling travelled east, carried along whispering telegraph wires to St. Petersburg. In the gilded halls of the Winter Palace, Tsar Nicholas II, a man burdened by the weight of an empire he was ill-equipped to rule, felt the news as a personal blow. He was the protector of the Slavs, a title that was both a sacred duty and a political necessity. To abandon Serbia now would be to betray a trust, to show weakness, not only to his enemies, but to his own people. His generals, men of stern countenance and unwavering belief in military solutions, urged him to act. They spoke of timetables, of strategic imperatives, of the inexorable logic of mobilization. Russia's army, they argued, was a vast and ponderous thing. To delay its call to arms would be to grant Germany, Austria's powerful ally, an insurmountable advantage. Nicholas hesitated, his mind a tempest of conflicting impulses. He signed the order for a partial mobilization, then, racked with doubt, rescinded it. He sent a personal telegram to his cousin Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, a desperate last-ditch appeal for one monarch to another. But the machine was already in motion. The pressure was immense. Finally, with a heavy heart and a sense of grim foreboding, Nicholas relented. He authorized a full mobilization of the Russian army. The act was not one of aggression, but of perceived necessity, a cumbersome defensive shield being slowly raised against an anticipated blow. In Berlin, the news of Russian mobilization was received not with alarm, but with a kind of grim satisfaction. It was the justification they needed. Kaiser Wilhelm II, a man of mercurial temperament who masked his insecurities with bombastic pronouncements, had already given Austria-Hungary his infamous blank check, a promise of unconditional support. His generals, led by the unflappable Helmuth von Moltke, viewed a war with Russia as not only inevitable but desirable. Russia was growing stronger with each passing year, its industrial base expanding, its railway network creeping ever westward. The longer Germany waited, the slimmer its chances of victory became. The Tsar's mobilization was to them the starting pistol for a race they were determined to win. Germany's own mobilization was a model of terrifying efficiency, a complex and intricate plan that had been wargamed and perfected for decades. It was a clockwork of steel and manpower, and the order to wind it was now given. On the 1st of August, the German ambassador delivered a declaration of war to the Russian Foreign Ministry. The first domino had fallen, striking the next. The intricate web of alliances so carefully woven in the name of security was now proving to be a net, dragging the great powers one by one into the abyss. In Berlin, the declaration of war against Russia was not an endpoint. It was the turning of a key. In a quiet, cavernous room within the headquarters of the German General Staff, a vast map of Europe was spread across a table, a continent reduced to coloured ink and paper. Here war was not a matter of politics or passion, but of physics, a problem of mass velocity and time. For decades, German military thinkers had been haunted by a single, terrifying geographic reality, the spectre of a war on two fronts. To the east, the slow, lumbering mass of the Russian bear. To the west, the vengeful modern army of France. To fight both simultaneously was to be crushed between them. The solution, conceived in an audacious stroke of strategic genius and breathtaking arrogance, was known as the Schlieffen Plan. It was not merely a plan, it was a prophecy, a minutely detailed script for a 6-week victory. The logic was as simple as it was ruthless. Russia, with its vast distances and primitive railway system, would take many weeks to fully mobilize its colossal army. France, however, could be at the border in days. Therefore, France must be defeated first, and it must be defeated quickly. The plan was a gamble predicated on speed, a right hook of overwhelming force. The main weight of the German army would not assault the heavily fortified Franco-German border. Instead, it would pivot a great swinging scythe through the flat, smooth pathway of neutral Belgium. Its armies would pour into the country, bypassing the French defences, encircling Paris from the north and crushing the French armies against the anvil of their own fortresses. It was a feat of pure, brutal geometry. Once France was knocked out of the war, the full might of the German Empire could be turned east to deal with the lumbering Russians at their leisure. The plan had one significant complication: Belgium. The nation's neutrality had been guaranteed by the great powers of Europe, including Prussia, Germany's predecessor, in a treaty signed in 1839. To the German generals, this treaty was a nuisance, a brittle legalism standing in the way of strategic necessity. They had already made their calculations. The violation of Belgium's sovereignty was a regrettable but essential component of their timetable. On the 2nd of August, German troops crossed into Luxembourg. On the same day, an ultimatum was delivered to Brussels demanding free passage for the German army. King Albert of Belgium, faced with an impossible choice, refused. Germany's response was immediate. With the declaration against Russia, already made, the declaration against France was a mere formality, another precisely timed step in the grand design. On the 3rd of August, Germany declared war on France, citing fictitious border violations as a pretext. The great, grey-clad legions were already on the move, a human river flowing towards the Belgian frontier, their hobnailed boots echoing on the roads. The world now turned its eyes to London. Across the English Channel, the British government was in turmoil. Britain was bound to France by the loose ties of the Entente Cordiale, an understanding, not a formal binding military alliance. The cabinet was deeply divided. For many, a war between the continental powers was not Britain's concern. The public, enjoying the warmth of an August bank holiday, had little desire to be dragged into Europe's ancient quarrels. But the invasion of Belgium changed everything. The 1839 treaty was not just a historical document. For Britain, it was a cornerstone of its foreign policy. The Belgian coast, with its deep water ports directly opposite the mouth of the Thames, could not be allowed to fall into the hands of a hostile power. It was a dagger pointed at the throat of England. The German invasion of this small, neutral country was both a moral outrage and an existential threat. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, a man whose face was etched with the strain of the crisis, dispatched a final stark message to Berlin. It was an ultimatum. Withdraw all German troops from Belgian soil by midnight, or a state of war would exist between Britain and Germany. The telegraph line between London and Berlin hummed with anticipation. But in the German Chancellery, the British ultimatum was met with disbelief and then with scorn. The Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg was aghast that Britain would go to war over what he called a scrap of paper. The deadline came and went. The German armies continued their inexorable advance. In London, as the chimes of Big Ben struck 11 o'clock on the evening of the 4th of August, the ultimatum expired. Britain was at war. The island empire, with its global reach and its unmatched naval power, had now entered the fray. The conflict was no longer European, it was global. The first act of the war at sea was swift and decisive. In the grey, choppy waters of the Heligoland, bite a formidable squadron of British warships, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon, fell upon a smaller German patrol. The engagement was a brutal, one-sided affair. The Royal Navy, with its 29 modern battleships, its revolutionary dreadnoughts to Germany's 19, was the undisputed master of the waves. The sound of heavy-caliber guns echoed across the North Sea as British shells found their targets with chilling precision. 3 German light cruisers, outmatched and outgunned, were sent to the bottom, their crews swallowed by the cold sea. It was a clear, unambiguous statement of intent. The seas belonged to Britain, and a vast, invisible net was now being cast around Germany. The British imposed a naval blockade, a silent, relentless siege designed to starve the German war machine. Patrols were established, neutral ships were stopped and searched, and any contraband goods, a category that would soon expand to include food, were prevented from reaching German ports. The strategy was long-term, a slow, patient strangulation aimed at bringing the German economy, and by extension its capacity to wage war, to its knees. But even as Britain celebrated its naval supremacy, a new and insidious threat was stirring in the depths. A week after the battle, the British cruiser HMS Pathfinder was on patrol off the Scottish coast. The day was unremarkable, the sea calm. Suddenly, without warning, a colossal explosion ripped through the ship's hull. She shuddered, listed violently, and then, in a matter of minutes, plunged beneath the waves, taking a devastating toll of her crew. The Pathfinder had not been struck by a shell or a mine. She was the first victim of a weapon that would change the nature of naval warfare forever, the submarine-launched torpedo. The German U-boats, or Unterseeboot, were a terrifying innovation. These sleek, cigar-shaped vessels could travel for thousands of miles on the surface and then slip beneath the waves to attack without warning invisible predators in a new three-dimensional battlefield. They were the perfect asymmetric weapon, a direct challenge to the dominance of the British surface fleet. On the continent, the land war was unfolding with a ferocity that stunned even its architects. The German advance through Belgium was not the smooth, unimpeded march envisioned in Berlin. The small Belgian army fought with a stubborn, heroic courage, making a stand at the fortress city of Liège. The city's ring of powerful forts held up the German First Army for crucial days, buying the French and British precious time to mobilize and deploy. The German response to this unexpected resistance was one of calculated brutality. Frustrated by the delays and unnerved by reports of civilian snipers, German troops began to carry out reprisals. In towns and villages across Belgium, civilians were rounded up and executed. Libraries were torched, homes looted, and a wave of terror was deliberately unleashed upon the population. These atrocities, magnified and sensationalized by Allied propaganda, painted a stark picture of the Hun as a barbarian turning public opinion in neutral countries, most notably the United States, firmly against Germany. While the Germans were being bled at Liège, the French army, blissfully unaware of the great encircling maneuver to their north, launched its own grand offensive. Plan 17 was a doctrine of pure, unadulterated attack, a romantic belief in the power of French élan, the fighting spirit that would supposedly sweep the Germans before it. Clad in their conspicuous bright red trousers and blue coats, waves of French infantry charged into the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine territory, lost to Germany in a previous war. In the series of engagements that became known as the Battle of the Frontiers, they collided head-on with entrenched German machine guns and artillery. The result was a slaughter. The French offensive was shattered, their soldiers cut down in their tens of thousands. The fields of Lorraine were carpeted with the dead and dyeing their colourful uniforms, a ghastly stain upon the summer landscape. The survivors fell back in disarray, their belief in a swift, glorious victory evaporating in the smoke and chaos of their first catastrophic encounter with modern industrial warfare. The plan, so elegant on paper, was already unravelling in a tide of blood. While the French army reeled from its disastrous offensive, the first soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force were making their way to the front. They were a small but highly professional army, volunteers to a man, their khaki uniforms a stark contrast to the archaic splendour of the French. They took up a position on the far left of the Allied line, near the Belgian industrial town of Mons, unaware that they were marching directly into the path of the main German thrust. The encounter at Mons was a collision of the old world and the new. The British infantry, renowned for their marksmanship, unleashed a blistering fire from their Lee Enfield rifles, a mad minute of rapid, accurate shooting that convinced the advancing Germans they were facing machine guns. For a day they held their ground against overwhelming numbers, inflicting staggering casualties on the German First Army. But courage and skill could not defy arithmetic. They were a tiny island in a vast grey sea, and as the scale of the German advance became terrifyingly clear, the order was given to fall back. The retreat from Mons was a grueling, heartbreaking affair. For 2 weeks under a relentless summer sun, the British and French armies were in full retreat, a long, agonizing fighting withdrawal. They marched until their feet were raw, catching a few hours of sleep in ditches and fields, always with the sound of German artillery rumbling behind them. The Schlieffen Plan seemed to be working to perfection. The great German scythe was swinging, poised to envelop Paris and crush the Allied armies. But the retreat, however desperate, was not a rout. It had bent the Allied line, but had not broken it. The German armies at the very peak of their advance were beginning to show the strain. Their soldiers were exhausted, having marched hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. Their supply lines, stretching all the way back to Germany, were becoming dangerously overextended. Small gaps began to appear in their advancing front. Just 40 miles from Paris, with the sound of the German guns audible in the capital, the French commander Joseph Joffre decided to make his stand. At the River Marne, he ordered the retreat to halt. Using the city's fleet of taxis to rush reinforcements to the front in a desperate last-minute improvisation, Joffre hurled his forces into a ferocious counterattack. The Battle of the Marne was a sprawling, chaotic vortex of violence, a desperate struggle that raged for 4 days along a front of over 100 miles. The French fought with the fury of an army defending its home, and the weary British Expeditionary Force turned and struck back at the exposed German flank. The German advance faltered, then stopped, then began to give way. Stunned by the ferocity of the counterattack, and fearing for their own overstretched lines, the German commanders ordered a withdrawal. The Schlieffen Plan, the great gamble for a swift victory, had failed at the gates of Paris. The miracle of the Marne had saved the city, but the cost was immense. Both sides suffered 250,000 casualties in a single week of fighting, a horrifying preview of the carnage to come. The Germans fell back to a strong defensive position on high ground behind the River Aisne. The character of the war was about to change. With the prospect of a quick victory gone, both sides now engaged in a race to the sea. Each army attempted to outflank the other to get around the northern end of their opponent's line in a series of lunging attacks and counterattacks that steadily extended the front line all the way to the coast of the English Channel. This race culminated in the First Battle of Ypres, a desperate, bloody struggle fought in the sodden fields of Flanders. Here, the last remnants of the old British regular army, aided by French and Belgian troops, clung on grimly against repeated German assaults, preventing a breakthrough that would have given the Germans the crucial Channel ports. The losses were again catastrophic. When the fighting at Ypres finally subsided in the mud and rain of late autumn, the mobile war on the Western Front was over. From the Swiss border to the North Sea, a continuous line of fortifications had been carved into the earth. The soldiers, seeking shelter from the deadly new trinity of machine guns, artillery, and barbed wire, did the only thing they could do. They dug in. They burrowed into the soil of France and Belgium, creating a vast, intricate network of trenches, a scar across the face of Europe that would define the war for the next 4 years. Trench warfare had begun. While the armies on the Western Front were digging themselves into a bloody stalemate, the war was erupting with equal ferocity on a second vast front in the east. Here the distances were greater, the armies more cumbersome, and the landscape a stark, flat canvas for immense and sweeping battles. In accordance with their pre-war agreements with France, 2 massive Russian armies had plunged into German territory, invading the province of East Prussia. The initial advance caused panic in Berlin, but the Russian attack was poorly coordinated, a lumbering 2-pronged assault that suffered from a fatal lack of communication. In one of the most egregious blunders of the war, the Russian commanders transmitted their operational plans over the radio using simple, uncoded messages which were easily intercepted by the Germans. This intelligence coup allowed the German 8th Army, under the command of a retired general, brought back to service Paul von Hindenburg and his brilliant but abrasive Chief of Staff, Erich Ludendorff, to set a devastating trap. They concentrated their forces against one of the Russian armies, leaving only a light screening force to delay the other. At a place that would forever be seared into the German national consciousness, the Battle of Tannenberg, they achieved one of the most decisive victories in military history. The German forces encircled and completely annihilated the Russian Second Army. The fighting was a whirlwind of confusion and collapse for the Russians, culminating in mass surrenders. Over 90,000 Russian soldiers were taken prisoner, and their commanding general Samsonov walked into the forest and took his own life, rather than report the scale of the disaster to the Tsar. The victory at Tannenberg was a stunning reversal of fortune. It was followed just 2 weeks later by a second, equally massive German triumph at the Masurian Lakes, where the other invading Russian army was shattered and forced into a humiliating retreat. In just 6 weeks of fighting, the Russian army had suffered nearly 1/3 casualties, a staggering blow that exposed the deep-seated weaknesses in its command structure and logistical support. Yet despite these colossal defeats, the sheer size of the Russian army meant it could absorb losses that would have crippled any other nation. While one limb was being savaged by the Germans, its other was striking a heavy blow against Germany's primary ally. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, an army of bewildering ethnic diversity and questionable morale, launched its own offensives into Russian Poland and Serbia. Both ended in catastrophic failure. The invasion of Serbia, the small Balkan nation that Vienna had intended to punish and swiftly conquer, turned into a humiliating debacle. At the Battle of Sur, the Serbian army fighting on its home turf outmaneuvered and decisively defeated the larger invading force, driving the Austrians back across the border. Simultaneously, the Austro-Hungarian offensive against Russia collapsed into a disastrous retreat. Their armies were poorly led and ill-equipped, and they were mauled by the Russians, losing more than 300,000 men. The great fortress city of Przemyśl was cut off and surrounded its garrison of over 100,000 men trapped in a siege that would last for months. The Germans, having secured their own borders, were now forced to rush south to bail out their flailing ally. They launched a diversionary attack towards the Polish city of Warsaw, a desperate bid to relieve the pressure on the Austrians. This led to weeks of brutal grinding combat, fought in the freezing mud and snow of the approaching Polish winter. Around the industrial city of Łódź, German and Russian armies bludgeoned each other in a series of chaotic and inconclusive battles. There was no clear winner, only a rising tide of casualties, and a deepening sense of a long attritional struggle ahead. As winter tightened its grip on Europe, the conflict continued to expand, drawing in new combatants. The Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, seeing an opportunity to settle old scores with its historic rival Russia, formally joined the Central Powers. Turkish warships under German command steamed into the Black Sea and bombarded the Russian ports of Odessa and Sevastopol, opening up a new front in the Caucasus Mountains. The war was no longer confined to the fields of France or the plains of Poland. It was becoming a true world war. The tendrils of the European conflict were now stretching across the entire globe, reaching the most distant and far-flung colonial outposts. In Africa, a continent carved up by the Imperial powers, the war took on a new, unfamiliar character. German troops stationed in German East Africa, the territory of modern-day Tanzania, crossed the border into British East Africa, now Kenya, and occupied the town of Taveta. In response, Allied forces, a motley collection of British, French and Belgian colonial troops, moved to seize Germany's colonial possessions. They quickly captured the small German colony of Togoland, but their other ventures met with stiff resistance. An invasion of German Cameroon was repulsed at the battles of Garua and Numsanakong, where well-led German and native Askaris inflicted sharp defeats on the larger Allied columns. An ill-fated attack on German Southwest Africa, modern Namibia, ended in disaster when a force of 3,000 South African troops was surrounded and forced to surrender at Saint-Fontaine. The most humiliating setback for the Allies occurred at the port of Tanga. A large British and Indian amphibious force attempted to land, but the assault was a masterpiece of incompetence and chaos. They were met by a much smaller but brilliantly led German force under the command of Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. He orchestrated a masterful defence using ambushes and flanking manoeuvres to throw the British landing into disarray, forcing them into a panicked re-embarkation. Cut off from any hope of reinforcement or resupply from Germany, Lettow-Vorbeck would go on to wage one of the most remarkable guerrilla campaigns in history, tying down a vastly superior number of Allied troops for the entire duration of the war. In Asia, the web of alliances brought another major power into the conflict. Japan, honouring its 1902 treaty with Great Britain, declared war on Germany. Their motives were less about European politics and more about expanding their own sphere of influence in the Pacific. Japanese forces swiftly moved to besiege and capture the heavily fortified German naval base at Tsingtao in China. Farther south, the German colonies of Samoa and New Guinea, small and isolated outposts of the Kaiser's empire, surrendered with little resistance to expeditionary forces from New Zealand and Australia. The war at sea, however, was far from one-sided. While the main German high seas fleet remained bottled up in its ports, a powerful squadron of German cruisers, the East Asia Squadron, commanded by the capable Admiral Maximilian von Spee, was still at large. Having left Tsingtao before the siege began, Spee's squadron roamed the Pacific, a phantom menace to Allied shipping. Off the coast of Chile at the Battle of Coronel, they encountered a British cruiser squadron sent to hunt them down. The British ships were older and outgunned. In the fading light of dusk, Spee used his superior speed and firepower to devastating effect, sinking 2 British armoured cruisers, the Good Hope and the Monmouth. Both ships were lost with all hands. A shocking and humiliating defeat for the Royal Navy. The victory, however, was bittersweet for Spee. He had expended a significant portion of his ammunition, which he could not replace, and he knew the British would now hunt him with overwhelming force. 5 weeks later, his premonition came true. Hoping to raid the British coaling station at the Falkland Islands, Spee's squadron sailed directly into a trap. A powerful British naval task force, including 2 new fast battlecruisers, had been secretly dispatched to the South Atlantic. The ensuing battle was a mirror image of Coronel. The German ships were systematically hunted down and destroyed. 4 of the 5 German cruisers were sunk, and Admiral von Spee went down with his flagship, the Scharnhorst. The victory at the Falklands effectively ended the threat of German surface raiders on the world's oceans. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, another vital strategic front was opening up. British forces, composed largely of Indian troops, landed in Mesopotamia and seized the Ottoman port of Basra. The objective was not conquest, but the protection of a critical resource, oil. The Anglo-Persian Oil Company's fields and refinery were the primary source of fuel for the Royal Navy's new generation of oil-fired battleships. Securing Basra ensured that the lifeblood of Britain's naval dominance would continue to flow even as the world descended deeper into a war of attrition. As the first winter of the war descended, a savage grinding rhythm took hold across all fronts. The initial hopes for a swift conclusion had frozen and shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a protracted siege. In the Balkans, the fighting seesawed with brutal intensity. Austrian troops, having regrouped from their initial humiliation, finally succeeded in capturing the Serbian capital of Belgrade. But their victory was short-lived. The Serbian army, displaying astonishing resilience, launched a ferocious counterattack. In a stunning reversal, they drove the Austrians back across the border once more, liberating their capital. The fighting in Serbia, a small nation with a population of less than 5 million, had already inflicted some 200,000 casualties on each side, a testament to the conflict's disproportionate ferocity in the very region where it had begun. In the North Sea, the German Navy, unable to challenge the British Grand Fleet in a decisive battle, turned to a new strategy of harassment and psychological warfare. In a daring hit-and-run raid, a squadron of German battlecruisers crossed the sea under the cover of darkness and fog and appeared off the coast of England. They unleashed a sudden, shocking bombardment on the seaside towns of Hartlepool, Whitby and Scarborough. The shells tore into houses, hotels and churches, killing more than 100 civilians and wounding hundreds more. The attack aimed at terrorizing the British public and luring a portion of the Royal Navy into a prepared trap, outraged British opinion, but failed in its primary military objective. It served only to harden British resolve and fuel a recruitment drive, the posters depicting ruined homes and asking Britons to avenge Scarborough. On the Western Front, the lines had solidified into a vast static scar of earthworks and wire. The French, desperate to break the deadlock and relieve pressure on their Russian allies, launched their first major offensive against the entrenched German positions. In the rolling chalk hills of the Champagne region, they hurled their infantry against the German lines in what became the First Battle of Champagne. The results were tragically predictable. The French soldiers advancing across open ground were met by a storm of machine gun fire and artillery shells. After weeks of bitter fighting, they had gained only a few thousand yards of blood-soaked mud at a cost of 90,000 casualties. The futility of the frontal assault against a prepared enemy was being written in the fields of France, a lesson that would be taught again and again at an ever-increasing price. Far to the east, in the snow-choked passes of the Caucasus Mountains, the Ottoman Empire launched its own ambitious winter offensive. Enver Pasha, the Ottoman Minister of War, dreamed of a grand pincer movement that would encircle and destroy the Russian army in the region. He ordered his troops to advance through the mountains in the dead of winter, with inadequate clothing and meagre supplies. The offensive was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. At the Battle of Sarikamish, the Turkish Third Army was not so much defeated by the Russians as it was annihilated by the elements. Thousands of soldiers froze to death in blizzards, their bodies left in grotesque, icy statues on the mountain trails. Of the army that had set out with such high hopes, some 60,000 men were lost, the vast majority to frostbite and disease. It was a disaster that crippled the Ottoman war effort on that front for a year, and yet amidst the unending slaughter a strange and surreal event occurred. As Christmas approached in certain sectors of the Western Front, the killing spontaneously paused. It began with the sound of carols drifting across the shell-scarred expanse of no man's land. Soldiers on both sides, German and British, cautiously emerged from their trenches. They met in the middle, exchanging cigarettes, souvenirs, and photographs of their families. In some places, impromptu games of football were organized, the frozen earth serving as a makeshift pitch. For a few brief, miraculous hours, the shared humanity of the common soldier transcended the hatred of the state. This informal truce, a moment of spontaneous peace in the midst of total war, would never be repeated on such a scale. It was a fleeting glimpse of a world that was rapidly vanishing, a poignant final flicker of the old order before the machinery of industrialized slaughter ground on. By the first day of January 1915, the war was just 5 months old, and it had already consumed the lives of around 1 million soldiers. A conflict that had begun with parades and promises of a swift victory had settled into a global meat grinder, a war of attrition that no one had foreseen and no one knew how to end. The new year brought no respite, only an escalation of the war's technological savagery. Germany, feeling the slow, inexorable squeeze of the British naval blockade, began to deploy its own novel forms of long-range attack. The skies over Britain, long considered an inviolable sanctuary, were breached for the first time by a new and terrifying weapon, the Zeppelin. These giant hydrogen-filled airships, behemoths of the air, floated silently across the Channel, under the cover of night on the world's first strategic bombing campaign. Their initial raids targeted the coastal ports of King's Lynn and Great Yarmouth. The bombs they dropped were small and inaccurate by later standards, but their psychological impact was immense. The sight of these immense, shadowy craft drifting through the clouds, raining death from above, brought the war home to British civilians, in a way the fighting in distant lands never could. Houses were damaged, a handful of civilians were killed, but a new dimension of fear had been introduced to the conflict. At sea, the naval war intensified. A German battlecruiser squadron venturing out on another raid was intercepted by a superior British force at Dogger Bank. In the ensuing running battle, the German armoured cruiser Blücher was crippled and sunk. But the rest of the German squadron managed to escape back to the safety of its base, frustrating the British hope for a more decisive victory. The real German threat, however, lay not with its surface fleet but beneath the waves. In retaliation for Britain's blockade, which was now causing significant shortages of food and raw materials, Germany declared the waters surrounding the British Isles to be a war zone. It announced a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. Its U-boats would now sink any Allied merchant ship they encountered, often without warning. This was a high-stakes gamble. Britain, an island nation, was utterly dependent on imported food to feed its population and imported materials to fuel its war industries. If the U-boats could sever these lifelines, they could starve Britain into surrender. But the strategy carried a grave risk. Neutral ships, including those of the United States, would inevitably be caught in the dragnet, threatening to draw the world's greatest industrial power into the war on the side of the Allies. On the Eastern Front, the German war machine continued to grind down the Russian army with brutal efficiency. Field Marshal von Hindenburg, now a national hero, launched a major winter offensive. At the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes, the Germans inflicted another staggering defeat on the Russians. Fought in the midst of crippling blizzards and freezing temperatures, the battle resulted in the loss of up to 200,000 Russian soldiers, half of them surrendering in the disorienting whiteout conditions. The Russians, however, found more success against the beleaguered Austro-Hungarians. The great fortress of Przemyśl, which had held out for 4 months, finally fell. The surrender of its garrison netted the Russians over 100,000 prisoners, a much-needed victory that provided a temporary boost to Russian morale even as their total losses climbed into the millions. Frustrated by the stalemate on the Western Front, the Allies sought a new theatre where they could strike a decisive blow against one of the weaker Central Powers. Their eyes turned to the Ottoman Empire. Winston Churchill, Britain's ambitious First Lord of the Admiralty, championed a bold plan to force the Dardanelles Strait with naval power alone. The objective was to threaten the Ottoman capital of Constantinople, knock Turkey out of the war, and open a vital supply route to their struggling Russian allies. In February, a powerful fleet of British and French warships began a systematic bombardment of the Turkish shore forts guarding the narrow straits. The initial attacks seemed promising, but as the fleet pressed deeper into the channel, they sailed into a minefield that had been secretly laid by the Turks. 3 Allied battleships struck mines and sank in rapid succession. 3 more were severely damaged. The naval attack, which had been predicated on the idea of a swift and easy victory, was called off in disarray. The failure of the naval assault made it clear that a ground invasion would be necessary to silence the Turkish guns. The stage was being set for a new and bloody campaign on the rocky peninsula of Gallipoli. On the Western Front, the grinding, attritional nature of the war continued unabated. The British launched a major attack at Neuve-Chapelle, hoping a short, intense artillery bombardment would blast a hole in the German lines for their infantry to exploit. The initial assault was successful, the British and Indian troops making a rapid advance, but the attack soon bogged down. Communication lines to the rear were cut, reinforcements were slow to arrive, and uncut German barbed wire and well-sighted machine gun posts halted any further progress. The small salient they had created could not be widened, and after 3 days of fierce fighting, the battle was called off. The limited gains had cost 11,000 casualties, a brutal lesson in the difficulty of converting a breakthrough into a breakout. 6 weeks later, near the battered city of Ypres, the Germans unleashed a new and even more terrifying weapon. As a favourable wind blew towards the Allied lines, German troops opened the valves on thousands of gas cylinders. A dense greenish-yellow cloud of chlorine gas, heavier than air, drifted slowly across no man's land and seeped into the Allied trenches. The effect was horrific. The gas attacked the lungs, causing a slow and agonizing death by asphyxiation. The unprepared French and Algerian troops holding the line choked, gasped, and fled in terror, abandoning their positions and opening a 4-mile gap in the Allied front. The Germans, however, were themselves unnerved by the effectiveness of their new weapon and lacked sufficient reserves to exploit the advantage. The gap was plugged by hastily rushed in Canadian and British reinforcements, but the Second Battle of Ypres marked the beginning of a chemical weapons arms race. Crude gas masks, little more than gauze pads soaked in chemicals, were quickly issued to soldiers on both sides, and a new layer of hell was added to the landscape of trench warfare. While the fighting raged in Flanders, the Allied invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula began. Troops were landed at several beaches, including a force of volunteers from Australia and New Zealand, the Anzacs, who were making their combat debut. Their goal was to seize the high ground of the peninsula, knock out the Turkish shore forts, and clear the way for the Allied fleet to sail to Constantinople. But the landings were a study in chaos and miscalculation. The Anzacs were put ashore at the wrong beach, a narrow strip of sand at the base of steep, rugged cliffs. They immediately met with ferocious resistance from Turkish defenders, commanded by the determined and capable Mustafa Kemal. Pinned down on the beaches and surrounding hills, all hopes of a swift advance evaporated. The Gallipoli campaign, like the war on the Western Front, quickly devolved into a bloody stalemate of trench warfare, with the Allied troops clinging precariously to their small beachheads. The day before the Gallipoli landings, under the cover of the war, the Ottoman government began a systematic operation against its own Armenian population. The Armenians, a Christian minority in the Muslim Empire, had long been persecuted and were now suspected of sympathizing with the enemy, particularly Christian Russia. What began as the deportation of Armenian intellectuals and community leaders from Constantinople soon expanded into a full-scale program of ethnic cleansing. Hundreds of thousands of Armenian men, women and children were forced from their homes and marched into the desolate Syrian desert. They were deprived of food and water, subjected to robbery and violence by their guards and roving bands. It was a death march on an industrial scale. The Allies, receiving reports of the atrocities, condemned the events as a crime against humanity and civilization and promised to hold the perpetrators to account. But for the more than 1 million Armenians who would perish from starvation, thirst and murder, the condemnation came too late. The Turkish government would later dispute the scale and intent of the killings, but the Armenian genocide became the first great atrocity of a century that would be filled with them, a dark shadow lurking behind the already horrific, conventional slaughter of the war.